I'm Shannon Speir. I'm with the University of Arkansas in the Crop Soil Environmental Science Department, and I'm currently studying intermittent streams in the agricultural landscape. I worked in a lab that actually did a lot of macroinvertebrate or insect work, but it was all related to mercury contamination, and so I knew I wanted to do something with contaminants, broadly speaking, or something that's causing an environmental problem. And I kind of just happened into the nutrient world in my master's and really fell in love with it and continued from there. I spend a lot of time in the field. I love to tell people that my everyday job is that I get to go play in streams. Not so much now as a professor as I might like, but it's always fun when I get to go out with my students and we get to be in the sites and take the samples and, kind of see everything firsthand. Today I'm going to talk about a couple different topics. We're going to focus on nutrient concentrations and transport in these intermittent agricultural streams, and then we're also going to think about how unpaved roads in the rural landscape influence sediment loss to downstream systems. The goal is to think about how we can then use things like agricultural conservation to kind of mitigate the impacts of agriculture on water quality and kind of be able to learn from that. And we're really focusing on a whole watershed scale here. Our goal and what really drives me in my research is, I find it broadly interesting, of course, but I really want to do applied work that is going to be useful, more broadly speaking, outside of the scientific community. And so we're definitely aiming to make what comes out of these next steps and even the current products we have now to help kind of inform management and really provide actionable outcomes. So today I'm going to talk to you about dry spells and dirt roads. So we're going to think about agricultural watersheds and how stream drying and unpaved roads can be issues for these systems. And so before I jump in, I just want to go through my acknowledgments quick. I like to thank the people at the beginning because they are so foundational to everything that I'm about to show you. And so, of course, none of this work would be possible without my funding sources. So DOE, EPA, and then an internal seed grant as well. And this first portion of my talk is going to be focused on the Quest project, which Ariel and I are both co-PIs on. All of the nutrient analysis was done at the University of New Hampshire. The many people from my lab, as well as collaborators who are integral to this work. And also, I have to definitely acknowledge Kathleen Cutting, who was a master's student with me and is now my lab manager. But the majority of what I'm going to show you today is her master's work. So, Headwater streams, maybe many of you know this, make up the majority of stream miles in the USA. You can see here, this is a screenshot of a very small area in northwest Arkansas, but you can see just how dense those first order streams are, which are our smallest streams. And they're super important because they are processing powerhouses, and so they have a really disproportionate capacity relative to their size to retain nutrients and transform them so that we can help protect water quality downstream. And so because of that, they're able to transform and retain significant amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus, which is going to be a big portion of my talk today, or NNP, through microbial processing, assimilatory uptake of nutrients by the biology, as well as sediment processes like sorption and desorption, which is especially critical for phosphorus. And then we also see that there's this really dynamic cycle of sediment storage and release that is driven by variation and flow in these systems. But many of these headwater systems are non-perennial, which means at some point of the year they experience drying. And so non-perennial streams are globally ubiquitous. They are everywhere and have been estimated to make up over 50% of the global stream length. And as we look to the future, the extent is likely going to increase with climate change. But because they don't have water sometimes, it makes them hard to study, and they are often not protected or considered when we think about managing water quality, which in agricultural systems in particular is really important. And so many of these systems end up being degraded in their habitat, their water quality, and their functional integrity. But they're super important. They act as critical ecotones at this terrestrial aquatic interface and kind of are the bridge between true terrestrial systems and true aquatic systems. And it has been hypothesized that they're super important for downstream water quality and regulating how protected our water is downstream in our more perennial reaches. But many studies are constrained to the intermittent reaches and don't often really look and expand downstream to these more perennial areas. But what we do know about the effects of drying include wet-dry cycles change redox conditions, which can mobilize sediment-bound nutrients from the bottom of the stream. Dry periods can also be a time where pollutants are concentrated in pools. And they also create really unique microbial communities, which can then affect nutrient cycling in these systems. And a lot of work in non-perennial systems have been done in forested landscapes, but many of these overlooked non-perennial systems are actually found in our agricultural landscapes. And agricultural streams are very prone to a lot of human influence and change from kind of their natural quote-unquote state. And so we have hydrologic alterations that can actually enhance intermittency through things like groundwater abstraction or channelization. Agriculture also alters nutrient transport through the addition of fertilizer on croplands and pasture lands. So we shift systems from those processing powerhouses that are able to really transform nutrients to systems that essentially send most of what enters them downstream. And then intermittent streams and agricultural landscapes in particular often lack even more regulation and protection, so that results in greater exposure to fertilizers, pesticides, and additional hydrologic modifications. Many of these systems are not regulated under the Clean Water Act that fall into agricultural areas. And so right now we kind of lack an understanding of how intermittency and agricultural land use really interact to alter downstream nutrient transport, which has big implications for things like downstream eutrophication, drinking water quality and safety. And so it's an important thing to consider. The reason in particular that I'm working on this in Arkansas is that over 74% of the total stream length in Arkansas is either intermittent, so it dries seasonally, or ephemeral, which means it only flows during storm events. But many of this intersects our agriculture. So in the northwest portion of the state where the university is located, this is predominantly pasture dominated as well as poultry farming. Tyson Chicken is headquartered in northwest Arkansas, so we got a lot of turkeys and chickens that we're producing up there. And then the majority of eastern Arkansas and the Mississippi alluvial plain is all row crop agriculture, both of which have significant impacts on nutrient cycling in streams. And I think this is just kind of a crazy stat, but this ultimately adds up to over 90,000 miles of streams are intermittent or ephemeral in the state. So overall, what we're going to talk about today is how does agriculture, intermittency, and infrastructure in the form of unpaved roads interact to control downstream nutrient loss and sediment loss in Brush Creek in Arkansas. And so the two kind of key questions we're going to talk through today are, one, how does intermittency and agriculture interact to control spatiotemporal patterns in nitrogen and phosphorus loss in Brush Creek? And then two, how does rural infrastructure, which are unpaved roads in this case, alter sediment loss in Brush Creek? And so Brush Creek is right here. It is located near Goshen, Arkansas, which, if you're familiar with the Fayetteville, northwest Arkansas, Bentonville area, it's just a little bit east of where University of Arkansas's campus is located. It is a relatively small watershed. It's about 50 kilometers squared, or about 5,000 hectares. And it is a third-order tributary to Beaver Lake. The reason that this is so important is Northwest Arkansas is very rapidly urbanizing. We have about 30 people moving to the area every single day right now. And Beaver Lake is our main drinking water source for anybody who is on city water. And there is growing concern that as population grows, we're shifting a lot of pasture land to urban land, that we may start to see harmful algal blooms occur in Beaver Lake, which so far we've managed to avoid. So it is a resource that needs protecting. If we're thinking about the land cover here, it's about half forested, about half pasture and hay, which is kind of the main dominant form of landscape scale agriculture going on. And then we have 76 poultry houses in the watershed as well, which very concentrated animal operations, great for adding nutrients to the landscape. And so just to give you a sense of this system, it has a really unique drying pattern. So the majority of the main stem is intermittent, where it is going to dry seasonally, and then the tributaries are mostly ephemeral, so they're flowing during storm events. Predominantly, the bottom here is this, so this is towards the outlet of the watershed. It's hydrologically active all year round, so we have pretty much sustained flow, minus one instance where our outlet actually did pool. The middle of the watershed is mostly dried or pooled, and then the upper watershed is active predominantly in the middle of the year. Now, I will caveat this saying we are sampling at baseflow conditions when we do these qualitative measurements. So we're not capturing storm flow in what I'm going to show you in this first part of the talk. And so for kind of the sake of simplicity, we've kind of defined two periods over the course of water year 2024 that I'm going to show you data for today, where we have this kind of active surface flow period from about January to May, and then this non-active low surface flow period across the watershed from October to December on the one side, and then June to September on the other side of the water year. One of the reasons we're really focusing on Brush Creek is that it is a pilot site for a program that I'm working on setting up called the Arkansas Discovery Watershed Program, which is a sister program to the Discovery Farm Program that is run with the Division of Agriculture's Extension at University of Arkansas. And so our goal here, and we're kind of entering this implementation phase, but we want to understand how conservation across the landscape in agricultural areas can also affect watershed scale nutrient loss. And so with Brush Creek, this is our representative of Northwest Arkansas with animal agriculture. And then beginning in 2028, we're going to add and expand to a row crop agriculture watershed in the Delta region, and then a forestry watershed in southern Arkansas. So that's kind of the bigger context and what this data is going to feed into eventually. So let's jump into our first question. How do intermittency and agriculture interact to control spatiotemporal patterns of nitrogen and phosphorus loss in Brush Creek? So to address this question, we sampled monthly using a synoptic sampling approach at 20 sites during water year 2024. There's Jackie in the picture there, if you know Jackie. She was a former undergrad in my lab. And we sampled at baseflow specifically again for both nitrate and soluble reactive phosphorus, or SRP. The reason we focused on baseflow is because this component of the project is something that pairs with efforts going on in New Hampshire, here in Alabama, New Mexico, and Nevada, and so we wanted to try and capture consistent conditions. So that is why storm flow is not a specific focus here. And then we also captured discharge measurements at each site using the cross-sectional area method. And so the first kind of sub-question we wanted to dive into were, do changes in surface connectivity result in changes in nitrogen and phosphorus export in Brush Creek? And so we hypothesized that nutrient loss is going to be greater and more uniform across the watershed during the wet season as a result of increased surface connectivity. And so what that would kind of look like, if you're a visual person, is under low connectivity, we're going to see a lot more patchiness as different portions of the watershed are disconnected from the main stem. And then that would result in also lower nitrogen and phosphorus loss with lower flows. And then when we have higher connectivity, we might expect there to be more uniformity as things across the landscape connect and sources are sent downstream to the outlet, also resulting in higher, represented by this bigger arrow, nitrogen and phosphorus loss. And so to kind of set the stage here, what we saw is really flow duration at a given site does have a big influence on nutrient concentrations here. And so we see this is percent flowing, so the number of dates we went out that a site had actual flow at it. If it is 0, that means it's a pool. So we did sample pools for concentrations as well. And then we've got ammonium on top, nitrate here, and SRP on the bottom. And we see kind of contrasting trends across the different types of nutrients, where ammonium and soluble reactive phosphorus are generally going to be highest in pools, and then as flow increases or flow duration at a site increases, we see a decrease. This is potentially because we have pools releasing from ammonium and SRP from the sediments under anoxic conditions. And this represents a potential risk of downstream loss when these pools are reconnected in storm events. And then nitrate, we see the opposite, where we actually see nitrate goes up with increasing flow duration, which suggests that low flow or pooled conditions may support removal processes like denitrification. And one of my favorite things to say is nitrate goes where the water goes. And so probably hinting at that piece is why we see these higher concentrations when we have more flow at a given site. So taking it a step further, kind of going beyond just raw concentration data, we did also see that low surface connectivity supports both nitrate and SRP removal across the watershed. We calculated a metric here called leverage. At its simplest, when you think of it, it's negative. That suggests that there's enrichment or increase in the concentration of a nutrient or solute production. 0 or around 0 suggests relatively minimal processing of that nutrient, and then a positive value indicates dilution or solute removal here. And so we saw differential patterns between nitrate and SRP at high connectivity. For nitrate here on the top, our blue is high connectivity. We see that the upstream sites are contributing to nitrate loss at the outlet, and we have this enrichment pattern occurring as we move downstream. For phosphorus, we're right around that 0 line, suggesting that phosphorus is essentially being conservatively transported, not really acted on by biology or physical processes during higher connectivity periods. In contrast, both of these were kind of same at low connectivity, where we do see some solute removal occurring, or that positive leverage value, which suggests that nutrients, as they move downstream, are being processed out from these upstream sources. Nitrate, likely denitrification is another key process here, as well as assimilatory uptake. And then SRP, probably also uptake as well. And then we've done some other separate studies that I'm not going to show you today, but sediment sorption plays a really big role in the phosphorus dynamics in this watershed. So when we think then spatially how this kind of lays out in the watershed, we see that nitrate is really spatially stable, regardless of surface connectivity. So through time, we kind of see the same for nitrate across the watershed, whereas we don't for phosphorus. And so spatial stability is another metric we calculated. It ranges from 0 to 1. Essentially, higher values are going to be more stable. I will note the values here that I'm showing you are all relatively high, so we're speaking in relative terms, okay? So nitrate, pretty stable across the water year, about 0.85 regardless of connectivity state. That suggests that drivers of loss are generally consistent regardless of connectivity, but SRP is actually kind of the opposite of what we expected, where it's less stable at higher connectivity. We expected less stability at low connectivity because of that hydrologic disconnection. So this was surprising. Wow. And so we think that maybe site-specific variability in sources of phosphorus across the landscape may be contributing to this pattern, but it's something we're definitely going to dive into and dig into a little bit more. The other thing we think about when we're thinking about agricultural streams is we want to think about nutrient transport and loading to downstream systems. This system flows directly into Beaver Lake, so there isn't really, another system it can flow into for those nutrients to be processed before they reach that critical drinking water source. And so what we see is that when we have more surface connectivity, we see nutrient loads at the watershed outlet increase with that high connectivity state, both for nitrate here and then for SRP here as well. And these are sub-watershed or watershed outlet loads. They're normalized for watershed area 2 as well, just for context. Again, reminding you that active period is January to May, non-active period October to December, June to September here. And so this increased activity that I'm calling it, or surface flow presence in the upper watershed, increased the outlet yield for both nitrate as well as soluble reactive phosphorus. And then if we pop in here, which my boxes didn't get covered up right, but that's okay. We do also see that with the percent of upstream sites that flow, so the more flow we have in the upper watershed, we see for nitrate a pretty clear pattern of increase with the percent of sites flowing. Again, base flow samples, that's why we really only hit 50% as this threshold here, because we're not capturing those storms, but more sites flowing upstream means more nitrate leaving the watershed at the outlet. SRP, we didn't see a significant relationship, but there is this big jump here. We double check this, triple check this. It's a real value. And so we're wondering if there is potentially a threshold effect going on here for phosphorus where we didn't have more sites flowing, on our x-axis, but if we were to sample at base flow, perhaps we see kind of this connectivity threshold where phosphorus jumps and that increases loads at the outlet. And then kind of the crux of this, thinking about agricultural landscape and how this controls these patterns or might contribute to these patterns, in addition to the intermittency patterns that we have observed. We thought that sites with more agriculture, more poultry, more pasture, were going to have greater nutrient loss relative to some of our subwatersheds, which are more dominated by forest cover. And we saw, at least for nitrate, some pretty clear patterns here where with increasing pasture as well as the presence of cows, so we were trying to kind of separate what was hay production versus what is actual cattle pasture land. We see both of these in panels A and B. We have an increase as that percent in the subwatershed increases. We see more nitrate coming out. With forest cover, we see that very classic pattern where nutrients go down with increasing forest cover as well. Phosphorus, it was a little bit all over the place. There are some trends where it's increasing, but they were not as consistent as nitrate, so goodbye. And then, interestingly, what was really surprising to us is that we didn't see any relationship with the number of poultry houses in the subwatershed. We think that most of these are relatively removed in terms of distance from the actual stream channel, and so we're wondering if there's kind of a landscape buffering effect that might reduce their impact on the actual water quality. And then we had to do some stats, get into the actual interaction of agriculture, so that pasture hay with flow state. And here we're separating our data between this flowing state and this pooled state. And we use linear mixed effects models to determine how these were interacting depending on the hydrologic condition. And so what we found is that both nitrate and SRP had significant effects or significant interactions, but they were in the opposite pattern for nitrate versus SRP. And so we see that when it's flowing, nitrate goes where the water goes. So nitrate increases with flow state as pasture and hay increases. But when we have, this is likely driven again by that landscape connectivity via both surface and subsurface flow, potential mobilization from the soils and the pasture land as well. But in contrast, we see when it's dry, pretty much no change across this gradient of pasture land in the watershed. SRP is the opposite. We see that when it's dry, we have an increase. So this is pooled conditions again, so there is still water present. And we think this is, again, potentially those sediment dynamics where we have desorption as those pools begin to go anoxic and have oxygen drawn down. And then there's also, we did an analysis of our residuals here where there is some suggestion that there's also a temperature dependent effect, which may be mediating the oxygen because we saw much higher SRP in reality than would be predicted by the model in the summer when temperatures are very, very warm. So to kind of wrap up the first part of the talk, we saw at baseflow specifically, there is spatial variation in both nitrate and SRP loss, or it was actually more uniform at low connectivity across the watershed, which contrasted our original hypothesis. And so this suggests there's consistent solute removal and higher spatial stability with lower connectivity. At high connectivity, we did see higher baseflow loads, so that means more is wet, more is leaving to go to Beaver Lake. So this could potentially be a silver lining to intermittency, right? If intermittency is projected to increase in the future, that may help mitigate some of the impacts of agriculture on downstream systems. I'm not saying we should turn our streams into intermittent streams either, so I want to be very clear about that, but it may be kind of a side benefit. And then pasture and hay is likely a key contributor to nitrate loss from the watershed, but doesn't play as big of a role for SRP, and this suggests that the farmers are probably predominantly using anhydrous ammonium or something like that to fertilize their land rather than manure sources, which tend to be big sources of phosphorus. So overall, agricultural watersheds, where there is increasing intermittency and periods of low connectivity, this may decrease nutrient loading downstream and help increase the predictability of baseflow nutrient patterns across watersheds. So that kind of wraps up part one. We're going to shift gears. We talked a lot about nutrients so far, but I want to talk about sediments as well. And one big piece of this watershed is that the majority of it contains unpaved roads. And there's been a lot of work done on unpaved roads, but they're predominantly in forestry settings, not so much in just broadly speaking rural landscapes. But from the forestry research, we do know that unpaved roads can serve as a huge source of sediments to streams. And in turn, this high total suspended sediments, or TSS, which is what I'm going to talk about today, can reduce primary production by blocking light penetration. We see potential for increased contaminant and nutrient concentrations and transport downstream because a lot of those like to bind to the sediment particles. And then for Arkansas specifically, this is really important because over 85% of county roads are unpaved, and those are roads that are maintained by the county. The majority of the roads actually in this watershed are privately maintained, and the landowners are responsible for this. So the extent of unpaved roads in Arkansas is very vast. And in Arkansas specifically, sediment is considered our leading water pollutant. So those kind of interact to emphasize that this is a really critical issue for the state. But a lot of remediation that's focused on unpaved roads and kind of best management practices for these systems really focus on low water crossings and improving those for fish passage. So there is a big focus on the biological impacts, which are obviously super important, but less so thinking about the sediment dynamics that may affect downstream systems. And so for this project, we were working in Brush Creek again, and we sampled 6 sites throughout the watershed, which you can see their layout here as well. And they ranged in road density from about 2.7 to 6.5 kilometers of road per kilometer squared of watershed area. Data was collected from February 2024 to January 2025, which included monthly grab samples upstream and downstream of road crossings at each of these sites. And we split our road crossings into 3 types. We had bridges, culverts, and direct stream crossings because we thought the type of crossing may have an important impact on how influential these different crossings were on downstream transport. We also were able to sample 4 opportunistic storm events. 1 in each season was how it actually kind of accidentally landed. So that was very awesome. And then we measured TSS using gravimetric analysis. So we filtered the water samples, weighed the filters, all that good stuff. And so our first research question here was, do sediment loads vary upstream versus downstream of road crossings in watersheds dominated by unpaved roads? And does the type of road crossing matter? We had some surprising events here that regardless of base flow on the left and storm flow on the right, upstream versus downstream sediment loads weren't different. Base flow, that was kind of what we expected because storm was going to be the important time for transport from overland flow. But this was true for both base flow and storm flow conditions as well. But we did see that yields were significantly higher during storm events. You can see the magnitude on this y-axis is an entire order of magnitude greater. So we do have a lot more sediments moving during storms. But road crossing type did have some influence on upstream versus downstream patterns. So here we calculated a metric we're calling delta TSS, where we took the downstream yield and subtracted out the upstream yield. And when this value is positive, this suggests that TSS is greater downstream of the road crossing, and when it's negative, we see that TSS is lower below the road crossing. And so we do see that at baseflow, direct crossings here in the brown do tend to have higher concentrations downstream. This is where a vehicle is driving straight across the road. And we intentionally sampled when there wasn't a car going across. You can imagine that if a car was actively driving across, churning up that sediment, we'd probably see much higher values. The surprising thing to me was that during storm flow, we saw lower TSS downstream compared to the upstream values. And we have noticed kind of anecdotally that many of the bridges, which is where we saw this pattern, have really big scour pools right upstream of them. And so we're wondering if those play a role in sediment deposition as things kind of move down the system. But that was a little intriguing and surprising find for us. And then we also wanted to know, does the extent of unpaved roads in a watershed and potentially the land use as well matter for sediment export here? And in general, we saw both road length and area of pasture and hay increase sediment loads. So you can see there's an increasing trend here. For our total road length, we did admittedly have a gap in our data set, so we got to go back and kind of explore that a little bit more, but it suggests that both the amount of roads present and then also pasture and hay, we're getting some kind of erosion going on there. And so ultimately for this piece of the talk, we saw road crossing type had less impact on sediment yields than we originally anticipated, but direct crossings do serve as the biggest source at base flow, which is a good portion of the year, right? Additionally, the largest storm event we captured, which you can see here in this picture, it looks like chocolate milk. There were 13 tons of sediment per day if we scale up our TSS measurements being transported on the falling limb of the storm. For context, that is like someone dumping an entire dump truck of dirt into the stream. So that's a lot of sediment. And this suggests that when we account for not just the falling limb, but rising limb, peak flow, when there is a lot of transport going on, the actual loss during a storm is probably a lot greater when we account for those other components of the hydrograph. And so we really think that we need to start kind of shifting our focus not just on biological benefits of remediating road crossings with unpaved roads, but also helping build out ones that are resilient and kind of erosion resistant. Maybe not resistant's not the right word, but at least resilient as storm intensities are expected to increase in the future. And also, given this area, much of the pasture land is what's being converted to like subdivisions and standalone homes and stuff, and so we're expecting also increases in rural traffic as well. And I like to show this picture because this is a culvert. This entire portion here was all, the sediment in the road used to be here. This was blown out in a single storm. So this wasn't gradual erosion over time, and so this is where that resilience piece really comes in and is very important. But if we think about kind of zooming out to the bigger picture, the so what here, part of the reason that we're really focused on this area is because recent work that we published last fall is showing that total runoff to Beaver Lake is increasing, especially focusing on spring and winter periods. And this is a really critical period of nutrient loss, typically nutrient transport, because it's the wettest portion of the year. This is likely in turn driving increased nutrient loads to Beaver Lake, which are known to be a key risk or key predictor of algal bloom risk. And so we need to think about, as these patterns and flow from these 4 main tributaries to Beaver Lake that had long-term USGS data. You'll notice Brush Creek's not in there. We don't have a gauge. But they're really important when we think about how nutrient loads might change to the future. And so understanding what's controlling these patterns upstream in terms of nutrient loss is going to really be important for managing water quality in this key drinking water reservoir as we look to the future. And with that, that's the end of my talk, but I have a shameless self-plug here. If you or someone else is a current master's student or has finished their master's and is looking for a PhD, I'm hiring 2 people to start in 2026. You'll be working in Brush Creek, so if you're not sick of it by the end of this talk, you can keep working there. But note, for the EPA farmer-to-farmer grant, it is required that the person who is paid on that grant is a U.S. citizen. But yeah, so anyway, with that, I will take any questions.